You're listening to episode 245 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Doug Smith joins us to speak about his paper from the Journal of the Oxford Center for Buddhist Studies, Was the Buddha an Anti-Realist? We see the debate all the time, particularly online. Did Buddha believe this, or did Buddha believe that? In particular, the gravity well seems to deepen when it comes to assertions about the nature of reality and existence, rather than centered on dukkha. So what might Gautama have thought about this thing we call reality, and how could we know it? Doug Smith has a PhD in philosophy, with a minor in Buddhist philosophy and Sanskrit. In 2013, he completed the year-long Integrated Study and Practice program at the Berry Center for Buddhist Studies and New York Insight Meditation Center. A longtime scientific skeptic, he pursues a naturalized approach to practice. He is also interested in scholarship about the Pitaka and the theoretical and historical origins of the Dhamma. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice ginger chai spice tea. Our guest today is Doug Smith. Doug, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Ted. Thanks for having me back.
It's been so great to have you as our blogging director for the Secular Buddhist Association. But the last time we had you on the podcast was quite some time ago, episode 128 on scientific skepticism and Buddhism. I'm wondering if you might just tell us a little bit about what you've been doing since, including your time doing the Integrated Study and Practice program at BCBS.
Yeah, well, the ISPP, the Integrated Study and Practice program, was with BCBS and the New York Insight group here in New York. So it was fortunately very convenient for me because it was in town. So it was a year-long study and practice program, just fantastic, with a number of really good scholars and practitioners, for that matter. It was a sort of a blend, and we went through the canon chunk by chunk, thematically rather than like by chapter or anything like that. But every time we would have a discussion with Andy Lenski, from Barry. We would have discussions with him, but then we would break off into separate groups and have group discussions, which were really great, really opened my eyes towards other ways of looking, even at the same material that I had been reading, by myself. Along with each month's, more study-oriented material, we also had a day of practice, which was fantastic always as well. So that was really a year that I learned a whole lot about the Dharma, but also, about sort of integrating the Dharma into your life, which is really what makes it so important, frankly.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about some of those other perspectives. What were some of the moments that made you just take stock for a moment in how you were thinking about the Dhamma?
Well, I tell you, one of the things that's kind of interesting is that the group in New York that I'm associated with is really quite secular in the sense that Andy is openly secular, at least in our discussions, and many of the people that I interact with there are secular in having their doubts about rebirth and so on. But in a course like this, of course, you're going to have a variety of opinions. And some people who were, believers in a more traditional kind of Buddhist worldview. And also, some people who were not skeptical in other ways. My own, background in philosophy, my background with friends and family tends to be in a group of people who are generally pretty skeptical about the kinds of things that, you hear in the bookstore under the metaphysical category, which we'll get to in a bit. But, there were some people who were, clearly believers in that stuff, and I found it both a challenge, but also a kind of a benefit to be able to deal with that kind of view and understand that it doesn't make a difference to practice, and frankly, it doesn't make much of a difference to your interpretation of the Dharma. I don't believe it, but, if they find it useful, then fine. I'm not gonna stand in their way, and I'm not gonna, make a scene in some kind of a group about why you shouldn't believe such a thing, because I just don't think that would be proper in that kind of context. So it was interesting for that reason. I think for me, particularly given my background.
Yeah, it's interesting for us as skeptics, as perhaps materialists, to encounter and have friendly, collaborative dialogue with people who may have very different views and still be able to respect the individual and understand that with the infinite complexities of people's lives, there may be very good reasons why they've landed in the place that they have and the views that they have, as we ourselves do.
Absolutely. And, as I say, one of the incredible things I think about this practice is that it really doesn't matter almost at all what what kinds of baggage you come to with it. I mean, you can believe pretty much anything you want to about the existence of heavens and hells and strange beings and, all that kind of stuff. And the practice is exactly the same. So, it really doesn't matter, frankly.
Well, let's get on to our topic at hand. Your newest paper was recently published in the Journal of the Oxford Center for Buddhist Studies. Can you tell us a little bit about what made you decide to write it?
The title of the paper is "Was the Buddha an Anti-Realist?" And this is a subject that I've been interested in for a long time, not necessarily about the Buddha in particular, but just as a general question about realism and anti-realism. When I first got into Buddhism, I was trying to think about, how it sort of started. Back in grade school, reading people like Gary Zukov, that kind of, what is it called, the Dancing Wooly Masters kind of books about quantum physics and how the mind created the world in some ways and that kind of stuff. And I found that really fascinating. This was a time in my life pre the skepticism stuff where I was, enthralled with the idea of extrasensory perception and, looking at, In Search Of on television and this kind of stuff.
With Leonard Nimoy, yes.
Leonard Nimoy, great Mr. Spock, Mr. Logical telling us all about these things. So when I got, later on in university, in high school, I did some meditation for the first time in university, thrown into, Buddhism class, my first semester there. And, just loved it, although on a more sort of a scholarly level, I guess you would say. But, the stuff about Nagarjuna, the Madhyamaka, this idea that in some sense we were radically confused about the way the world works, was I found very interesting and appealing. And it informed the practice that I had at that time, which was a Zen practice. I founded the Zen Society, which was a complete nonsense. It was about 3 people, but that's all right, at the university that I was at. But it was mostly for meditation, which was great. And the idea of the koan study in Zen, sort of trying to break you away from sort of an over-reliance on a rational, conceptual approach to reality. This was great for me because at the time I was undergraduate doing philosophy and then went on in graduate school. And then later on in graduate school, I began to sort of be peeled away from the sort of anti-realist stuff and became more interested in a more sort of, I would say, down-to-earth kind of approach to the way things are. But at the same time, taking classes in Tibetan Buddhism with the Geshe there when I was in graduate school, on the Madhyamaka in particular, that kind of stuff. So this has always been sort of an interest of mine. And when more recently I came to, a real deep interest in the Pali material, I mean, what struck me most of all, I think, was how different it was certainly from the Madhyamaka, but from all the later material, and how it provided a more, I think, a rational kind of, explanation for both the belief but also the practice, why it is that you were supposed to sit quietly for long periods of time following the breath. I mean, that wasn't really explained. I mean, I understood that it seemed to have a good effect upon me, but having read, so many of the sutras in the Pali Canon, now I have I feel like I have a better understanding of why that's a reasonable kind of practice. So, I mean, that was sort of the background, that sort of deep background. Also a feeling that within the West, I think there tends to be an interpretive move of the early material that is informed more by, let's say, Tibetan philosophy, Tibetan Buddhist philosophy, and Zen, which are probably the two most prevalent kinds of Buddhist study and practice in the United States, at least, that tends to, I think, at times read that stuff back into the early material. Also, many of the people doing Buddhist studies tend to be very much influenced by postmodernism, which again has a very sort of skeptical view. It's postmodernism taking off from the notion that there are problems with the Enlightenment picture of reality, that there are, sort of deep conceptual and epistemological issues, problems we have with knowing the way things really are. And that tends to also inform, I think, the way people read the early material. And my feeling was, perhaps coming from a different background, that sort of didn't get the early material exactly right. That took a picture of the Buddha as more of a skeptic than he really was, or at least than he really seemed to be. And so when I ran across this book by Alex Wynn, a new book that he was just out, I guess it was last year, I had been in conversation with him already. And the book, did this. I mean, of course, he, as far as I know, has, he studied with Richard Gombrich. He's got a very, very good background in the Pali material, certainly much better than I do. But, he was reading that same material back, it seemed to me, into the early stratum. He was sort of saying that the Buddha was a radical skeptic in a certain way. That the Buddha was teaching what we would call an apophatic view, that is to say that reality is beyond all description. So I was confused by this and sent him a number of emails. We had a long sort of email back and forth about it. I was asking him, where do you see this in the Pali Canon? What are the suttas that you see? How do you interpret them? So on. And he referred me to a couple of his papers and obviously his book, and sent me some other material. And I pondered over it for several weeks and just decided that I had to write something. And I really honestly never thought it would get published. It was more feeling that, I had to get something out of my system. And, if I could send it to Alex Wynn, and maybe he would either tell me where I was wrong, or, maybe point me to somebody else who could, who could help me figure this out, that would be enough. And so basically that was the genesis of the paper.
So let's talk a little bit about realism versus anti-realism, what those are, and how you see those showing up in Buddhist discussions. Why does it matter?
Yeah, well, those are two separate questions, really. I'll deal with the first about what is realism and anti-realism first, I guess. And this is quite a difficult topic, because these are concepts within Western philosophy. You don't, so far as I know, have anything quite like those terms, certainly in the Pali. There may be some terms that I'm not familiar with in Sanskrit, later Buddhist Sanskrit. But basically the realist wants to say that there exist things in the world that are not dependent immediately upon us, upon minds, upon our concepts, that there are things we can be wrong about, that reality in some way isn't simply a construct either of our minds or of our beliefs or of our concepts. These kinds of things sort of go under that general heading of realism. The anti-realist wants to say that, or I should say the extreme anti-realist wants to say that all of these things are illusions, that all of the physical world and perhaps even all of the mental world is a kind of an epiphenomenon, that it's a kind of production of our own concepts. And that if we could get beyond those concepts to the way things really are, we would see something that was absolutely indescribable. Now, it's important to say that in more sophisticated kinds of both realism and anti-realism, in the West at least as they've developed, there'll be a mix, so nobody's really, on all the way on one end or all the way on the other, or very few people. Most people are somewhere in the middle, say that, these things tend to be a blend. It's important also to say that this is a topic in what's called metaphysics, and metaphysics is a really purely Western phenomenon. In other words, the word comes from the book or the material after Aristotle's Physics, where he just threw a bunch of stuff together about being, about substance, about the way things really are, and there's no word that I know of that comes really anywhere close to that in the Pali, so questions about whether the Buddha really did metaphysics or cared about metaphysics are sort of idle because he didn't even have a word for it. So a lot of this has got to be, and I would be the first to admit it, a kind of an interpretive move, of trying to say, okay, what would he, what might he have said if he were alive today dealing with this kind of material? Because really you can't find a straight answer one way or the other because he just didn't have the words for them. They were not in the dialogue of the day. So I don't know if that helps you understand basically the issues, but
yeah, it shows there are different ways of thinking that have a lot of gray places in the middle where many of us may land on that bell curve, but that one is that reality it's a thing. It's actually there. Stuff is actually out there.
Yeah.
And the other would be, no, these are illusions. They're not as we perceive.
Yeah, and again, there are extremes where one extreme is everything is the way it appears to us, really out there, independent of us. Okay, that's an extreme that's not really very defensible, but some people might believe that. The other extreme, again, is that everything absolutely, completely is a complete illusion, and there really isn't anything. I mean, you can end up being a nihilist about it. That would be another extreme, and again, really nobody holds that position, but everyone's somewhere in between. So yeah.
So how are you seeing this show up in Buddhist discussions? Why do we care?
Yeah, no, I mean, and it's a good question. Honestly, one of the reasons people care about this is probably because they got too much time on their hands, really. I mean, the heart of Buddhism is practice, and I am absolutely convinced of that after many, many years of this. It used to be that I really did look at the philosophy as being almost paramount, and now I do see the practice as paramount. But these kinds of issues can inform practice, and that is one way that they might matter. And and also they matter for scholarly reasons. I mean, scholarship is important for its own ends. It's important to know, just for the sheer fun of it, to know what somebody might have thought 2,500 years ago. It's important, I think, also because it opens up more possibilities, both in belief and in practice. Because insofar as we sort of wall off one philosophical option or one move that could be made, I think we narrow the realm of the range of possibilities for a practitioner or a believer or somebody entering the system. My own feeling is just that it's important just because if you read the texts, I believe you really can't come to any other position than that he was more or less kind of a realist. But, there's room for other interpretations as well. And certainly there are passages and certain sutras that seem otherwise, and certainly many of the later, most brilliant Buddhist philosophers had another view. So, there's certainly a range of different possibilities here.
So your position in the paper is that Gautama may have fallen more towards the side of the realist than the anti-realist. What was your most compelling reasoning behind it that you found?
I mean, there are a number of them. I would say probably the most direct has to do with contact, because contact plays such an important role within Buddhist philosophy. That is, contact between sense object, sense base, and consciousness sort of being the origin of perception, the origin of consciousness, the origin of so many things. And it seems to me that the basic notion of contact is, at least at first glance, realist, at least somewhat realist, because it involves three things, two of which are not consciousness. Okay, that being the sense base, or let's say the eye or the ear, and the sense object, that is to say the thing in the world that is responsible for the perception. You know, again, all these things are certainly debatable, and one wouldn't want to say, okay, that's a knockdown, drag-out argument. It's not, but at least it's some prima facie kind of, way of saying, well, he did put the whole structure in terms of these three objects, and two of them are not consciousness. Two of them are interacting with or producing consciousness. And one of the metaphors, or the sort of only, so far as I know, metaphor he uses to explain contact is in terms of fire sticks. That is to say, he says that perception, consciousness perhaps, is like the rubbing together of two fire sticks, the two fire sticks being metaphors for the sense base, that is, let's say, the eye, the ear, and the sense object, that is to say, the object being seen or heard. And that when they come into contact, then you get this fire. That is to say, they rub together, they create heat, fire. Then when they are taken apart, that is to say, you remove one from the other, then the fire dies down, the mind calms down, and then he says the fire sticks may be left aside. And again, the metaphor of leaving aside suggests something independent of our own consciousness. It suggests something external to us, something that the existence of which doesn't depend immediately upon our conceptual apparatus for its existence.
Yeah, and I would ask, as a natural follow-up to that, to an anti-realist, is bearing that structure in mind, that there is a sense base, there is an external object, and there must be a contact between the three along with the sense consciousness. In order for contact to exist, why would that be the case if all was illusion?
Yeah. Now, I mean, of course, you have to say, I mean, in all fairness, that there's always moves that can be made, and there's always things that can be said. And of course, you can claim that all three are sort of, how would you say, a kind of a bubble, an illusion within our own concept of the world. And then if we really see things from a nirvanic perspective, that all that dissolves. I mean, these are certainly possible moves, but I just don't find those moves explicitly in the texts described well. The one thing about many of the passages that generally people like Alex or Luis Gomez, who was another great writer, scholar who wrote about this earlier in the 1970s, is they tend to pick passages that are verse-oriented. And they're beautiful passages, but the problem with verse from a philosophical standpoint is it tends to be less clear and tends to need more exegesis to understand what's being said. And so I always think that you have to be a little careful when dealing with verse sections of the sutras, and it's always better if you can refer us to a piece of prose which explains in, I think, more clear detail. But, there's obviously more than one opinion about these things.
This might be a good opportunity for us to talk a little bit about practice, because one of the things that I find happening in discussions, particularly online, about this kind of debate, this kind of topic, is that it seems to distract from what really is at the heart of Buddhism itself. This is about suffering or dissatisfaction, about how to live in the world. And these seem to fall into categories of how many angels dance on the head of a pin. So I'm wondering if you could shift us over a little bit into practice.
Well, once you get into practice, which I think is, as you say, the real heart of Buddhism, then things get both more complicated and more simple. I think they get more complicated in that there's really more, many, many more options and many, many valid ways of approaching it. And I think one has to be careful about ruling some way out, because everyone learns in a different way and everyone has a practice that fits their own personality. For myself, I tend to need a reason for doing things. Being a skeptic, that's my background, that's, my philosophical training. So I'm very leery about any extended practice that I don't understand. I'm willing to try something if someone says try it, but if there isn't an obvious reason, I just don't see the point. And to that extent, my approach to practice tends to be more conceptual, let's say, than would be thought of as ideal in a Zen practice, for example, where concepts are looked upon as part of the problem. And reason itself is looked upon as part of the problem. You have to find the practice, I think, that gels most with yourself. So when I look to my own practice, I look to the suttas that make the most sense to me. When I'm with a teacher who's telling me something to do, if I don't understand it, my first question will be, what is the point of this? Where are we going with this line of questioning? But another part of practice that is so important, and in fact that you get in a lot of the texts, the Atthakavagga in particular of the Sutta Nipata, which many people look to as an example of an anti-realist text, is the idea that we really have to learn through practice to cease clinging to our own concepts, ideas, beliefs. And that doesn't mean, at least, again, from my own perspective, doesn't mean that we have to not believe them. It doesn't mean we're trying to find a state of non-belief or of no views, because I don't know what that would be. But rather that we have to learn to treat views as we treat houses and cars and our own body. They are facts in the world, but they are not I, not mine, and not myself. For example, the Buddha talks about not feeling remorse or anger when somebody criticizes him, and not feeling elation when somebody praises him. That's obviously something that I don't. That's not something true of me right now, and probably won't be true of me for many, many, many years, if ever. But that's the goal. The goal is to get yourself to a position where you aren't personally attached to your own views as mine, so that when somebody calls them into question, you feel personally attacked. That is, I think, the goal of practice. And so that, when I look to my work as a blogger, when I look to my work in this paper, I try to look at that from a position of not I, not mine, not myself. It's simply something that was written. Obviously, it's something that I believe, but the belief is just a fact. It's not something that I have to cling to. At least that's really what I focus on, because obviously it's something difficult to overcome at times. And I think one of the issues with so much academic argument, so much online argument, is that they get so personalized, and everybody feels that they have to defend their own turf.
Vested ownership of these views.
Yeah, and it can get pretty nasty, and I think that was one of the things, I think clearly that was one of the things that the Buddha was arguing against in the Atthakavagga, was that kind of nastiness. And it's a lifelong practice, and I don't want to make it sound as though I think it's easy, because it's not, but at least that's the aim, is to get to a position where we aren't investing it with our own, my, me, mine kind of thing.
Let's shift a little bit to something that you're working on with our friend Justin Whitaker. You have Reading the Buddha as a Philosopher. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh, yeah. Well, this is a paper that Justin and I wrote several years ago, actually, and it's coming out in the spring. It's in a journal that's sort of a more, normal academic journal in the sense that it's got like a 3-year backlog of papers, as opposed to the Journal of the Oxford Center for Buddhist Studies, where they can get stuff out pretty quickly. The general idea is that both of us are interested in philosophy and in Buddhism, both Justin and I, and feel that it's a real tragedy that the Buddha, as a person from the Pali Canon, that is to say the Pali stuff, is just not studied in the West. Hardly at all, and certainly almost never in the context of a philosophy program. And both of us feel that that's a real shame, and that there's reasons why he should be studied as a philosopher. Which isn't to say that the Buddha was a philosopher, because, again, the word philosophy is a Western word, has lots of Western connotations, and that sort of doesn't matter. It's just so much naming. What matters is that he had a lot of really interesting things to say, which can be understood as ethics in the Greek sense of learning the best way to live your life. And these are things that, as said in the Pali Canon, were really never said anywhere else by anybody else in quite the same way. And in many circumstances, I think, he's pretty clearly one of the wisest people who ever lived. So he deserves to be studied, and the only way to start doing that is to start producing papers like this, where we say, look, if you look at the material, here's what you find. And frankly, I was shocked that it was accepted, that the paper was accepted, because I had expected that this would be so far away from being contemporary as not to be, as not to be believed, because I thought that this sort of would have been over, water under the bridge. But apparently it's not. So I was really happy that they thought it was worth publishing. And so anyway, it's out in the spring, and we'll see.
Excellent. Well, I'm looking forward to having you and hopefully Justin join us to talk about that paper. Our guest today, Doug Smith. Doug, as a reminder to the listeners, is the blogging director for the Secular Buddhist Association. And again, I will be linking to his paper, Was the Buddha an Anti-Realist, on the episode page for this episode. Doug, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much, Ted. It's been fun.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.